When we first started winter backpacking, we screwed up everything. You should learn from our mistakes, and it's time to talk about things that we wish we knew sooner for winter backpacking.
Can you say like and subscribe?
Like, subscribe.
And can you say buy some merch?
Buy some merch.
And can you say click the notification bell?
Click on the bell.
Okay, we'll take it. All right, what'd you wish you knew sooner?
This is a general subject because then it'll spill over to a lot of things.
Okay.
You don't, like, again, everybody says these things, but until you experience it yourself, you don't really understand the importance. Things I wish I would have known sooner is how much condensation occurs in the winter.
Yep.
And I'm not just talking about condensation on your tarps or your tents or something like that. I'm talking about like everything getting wet. Everything. It's just classic for the winter for us. And so just knowing that, then knowing what you need to do to be comfortable in dealing with that amount of condensation, I wish I would have known sooner.
How do you deal with it?
Redundancy. Tons of redundancy. I mean, everything's gonna be wet, so you're gonna be touching everything, so your hands are gonna constantly be cold. So gloves, and then your gloves are gonna get wet. So another set of gloves. And so like, just things like that, like, you know, everything you're wearing is going to get wet. Your feet are gonna get wet, your socks are gonna get wet, your gloves are gonna get wet, you're gonna be touching everything, you're gonna be rubbing up against everything. So just having just so many different like backups for hats, gloves, clothing, like that type of thing, makes it a little bit easier to deal with that condensation. And also like, you know, strategies around packing up your tarp and your lines and stuff like that if you're a hammock camper like I am. But everything you touch is gonna get wet, and it's just, it can be a lot to deal with. And if you have like one pair of gloves, they're just gonna get soaking wet, and your hands are gonna be cold because you have to touch everything. And have fun like tying lines, throwing bear bags, getting stakes out, like all that stuff with wet hands. That's a lot of fun.
One thing that I wish I knew sooner about winter backpacking, I'm gonna rant a little bit, is that temp ratings on gear are complete nonsense for the most part. We have used gear, quilts, pads from so many different companies, and I will tell you, a 30-degree quilt in this company and a 30-degree quilt in that company could feel totally different. Same goes with pads, same goes with jackets. You really don't want to depend on a gear manufacturer's temp rating. Always be conservative about it. There's very few companies. I'll shout out Underground Quilts. Their temp ratings on their quilts are definitely legit, but most companies, their temp rating, it's not a temperature you're gonna have fun at, it's a temperature you're gonna survive at. So if you buy a 20-degree sleeping bag, if you're actually in 20 degrees, you're not gonna have a good time. I've experienced this with multiple different companies' gears. So just know, temp ratings are generally nonsense. Do not rely on them. Be a little conservative, and I would give yourself an extra 5 to 10 degrees off of the rating that is on the manufacturer. So I've gotten burned by those. Temp ratings can be nonsense.
Something that kind of threw us off too, not as much daylight in the winter.
Nope.
Not as much daylight.
It sucks.
Yeah, it sucks. So when you're building out your routes and your mileage, you really need to take that into account.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you're gonna want to get to camp like around 2. Like, just being honest. If you're like us and like camp time, you want to get to camp around like 2 to 3 at the max, because you need time to set up your tent, you know, do all your camp chores, hang your bear line, collect firewood, like that type of thing. And generally people like to get that done before it's pitch black outside. So you don't have as much daylight, so it makes it, you know, limits the amount of mileage you can do, unless you're one of those psycho people that just hike in the dark all the time. So anyways, it's something I knew about, but you don't really realize it until you're out there and you're like, oh man, we have 12 miles to go and we only have about 4 hours of light. This is gonna be rough.
Another thing I wish I would have known sooner about winter backpacking is if you're sleeping on the ground in a tent, you basically have to have a double wall tent, especially in the Midwest, and that is for two reasons. Primarily condensation, but also for heat. A double wall tent keeps you much warmer, and any condensation that forms will form on the outer layer of the tent, not the inner layer. And what that means is when you're rolling around in the tent in there, your foot box, your stuff's not gonna get wet. In the winter, especially in the Midwest, you almost always get condensation because the air cools down, inside your tent's a little warm, water will collect and freeze on the outside of it. I have dealt with it on my foot box and all my stuff, so I only do a double wall tent in the winter, and even better yet, get yourself a hot tent.
All right, I've talked a lot about condensation because it's one of the things that I've learned the most about when it comes to winter backpacking. So I'm just going to come out and say an obvious one. Waterproof the crap out of your gear. I think like when we talk about like lightweight backpacking, you know, you can start thinking about like how many stuff sacks am I using, how much weight is that, and I think that's all good and stuff, but like in the winter, when stuff is going to get wet all the time, having the ability to set that stuff aside in its own waterproof bag, or having everything else waterproofed, also just the amount of precipitation that you can encounter is just really important. And waterproofing your gear isn't necessarily always just because you fear like rain or snow, like being in those conditions all day. It's also like, you know, packing up your tent, packing up your tarp. Like if you put your tent inside of your pack, like what's it rubbing against? It's gonna heat up, it's gonna get soaking wet. Is it gonna touch your down? Is it gonna touch your spare clothes? So just be a maniac about waterproofing.
Another thing this is gonna sound obvious, but something I really wish I would have done more of before getting more into winter backpacking is you have got to test your gear. I'm not saying you gotta fully go out overnight and test it, but if it's cold outside, go out there with your quilt, go out there with your pad, test your gear, not just your sleep system, test your jackets, test your coats, I guess that's the same thing, test your pants, test trying to set up your tent when it's cold outside and your hands are numb. Test, test, test. You know, we always say to do that in general, but it is especially more important in the winter when like you can get in a dangerous situation if you screw up really bad. So test all your gear beforehand, test setting it up, make sure you're comfortable with the temp ratings of your gear, and just test, and make sure you do that before you go out winter backpacking. Another thing, this is gonna sound obvious, but I wish I would have known sooner, is the value of a few things. One, when we go winter backpacking now, we, as much as it sucks and it's hard, we always make a fire. That's important for a variety of reasons. The obvious one being you have a source of warmth, but something about winter backpacking is like, you really don't want to just be sitting around camp for a long period of time just sitting there doing nothing. So having a fire not only keeps you warm as a heat source, but it keeps you moving, because you always gotta be getting wood, you always gotta be tending to the fire, you always gotta be doing stuff. So my point is, have a fire, but also just, you know, enjoy yourself, whatever, but don't like do your camp chores, just do things, stay up, stay moving. It's gonna help you stay so much warmer. We used to go winter backpacking, get out there, no fire, just sit there, freezing completely, but having a fire, doing things, you know, hiking around, sawing wood, just doing things in general is so helpful, and you'll be so much warmer and you will not go to bed cold. That's the end of this video. Listen, winter backpacking is fun, all right? It sounds challenging because it is challenging, and you gotta be safe and smart, but we always implore people, please go winter backpack, give it a try. You don't have to do a bunch of nights, but the forest is a different place in the winter, and there are specific advantages to backpacking in the winter, so it's not something you should be afraid of. But this is, you know, things that we didn't realize about winter backpacking, so hopefully you can leverage that, and when you go out there, you're not having a terrible time. So go out there, enjoy the winter, enjoy the forest, and we'll see you all on the next one. Bye-bye.